Imagine standing on the edge of your destiny, the culmination of a lifelong journey, but knowing you won't be the one to cross the finish line. That's where Moses found himself, on the dusty plains of Moab, looking out at the promised land. But he wasn't looking at the generation he led out of Egypt. They were gone. He was speaking to their children, a generation born in the wilderness, who knew the hum of the tabernacle far better than the shadow of the pyramids. Before they crossed the Jordan River, Moses gave them what is arguably the most important history lesson ever recorded. It wasn't about memorizing dates. It was a raw, honest look at where they had come from, so they wouldn't mess up where they were going. This is the heart of the first few chapters of Deuteronomy. Moses starts by taking them back to where it all began for them as a nation. Mount Sinai, or Horeb. They had spent a year there, receiving the 10 Commandments, building the Tabernacle, basically living in a holy bubble. But God never intended for them to stay there forever. Moses reminds them of God's command. You have stayed long enough at this mountain. Break camp and move on. The destination was clear, promised to their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The GPS was set. It was time to go. But Moses doesn't sugarcoat the past. He immediately brings up their greatest failure. The disaster at Kadesh. This was their first shot at entering the land. They were right on the doorstep. But instead of trusting God, the people demanded to send spies. When the spies came back with terrifying stories of giants and fortified cities, the people's courage just melted. Moses recounts how he tried to rally them, saying, "Don't be afraid. The Lord your God will lead you, and he will fight for you. Just as you saw him do in Egypt and in the desert, you saw how he carried you, just like a father carries his child, all the way here." But they wouldn't listen. Think about the irony. They were more afraid of the Canaanites than they were of the God who had just brought the mighty Egyptian empire to its knees. Because of that fear, that profound lack of trust, God declared that none of that generation, except for Caleb and Joshua, would ever see the land. What followed was 38 years of wandering, but Moses frames this period not as a pointless, meandering punishment, but as a time of transition and constant divine care. Even in judgment, God never abandoned them. Looking back, Moses says something remarkable. Remember how the Lord your God has blessed everything you've done. He has taken care of you as you wandered through this vast desert. He has been with you these 40 years, and you have always had everything you needed. Their shoes didn't wear out. Their clothes didn't fall apart. They were never without food. They weren't just surviving. They were being supernaturally sustained. To build the confidence of this new generation, Moses then points to their very recent victories. These kids had seen it with their own eyes. When they asked King Sihon for a peaceful passage, he refused and attacked. Israel, led by God, crushed him. Then came Og, the king of Bashan, a literal giant whose iron bed was over 13 feet long. He was the kind of guy who would have terrified their parents. But this new generation, with God on their side, defeated him and took his land. These weren't just war stories. They were proof. They were lab results confirming that God's power and promises were still active and effective. The giants their parents feared were no match for their God. Finally, Moses gets to the whole point of the history lesson. He delivers a passionate plea. He knew the biggest threat they would face in the Promised Land wasn't an enemy army. It was their own memory. The danger was that once they settled down in comfortable houses, eating from vineyards they didn't plant, they would forget. They would forget the God who carried them through the desert. His final charge is the thesis statement for the entire book. Be careful, be on your guard, and do not forget the things you have seen. Don't let them pass from your minds as long as you live. Teach them to your children and to your grandchildren. This history lesson wasn't about the past. It was about the future. It was a lesson in the character of God, his holiness, his justice, and his relentless, faithful love. And Moses gave this speech knowing he would never cross the Jordan. He was the bridge, the connection between the old generation's failures and the new generation's future, ensuring that the mistakes of the past would finally be left behind. Thanks so much for watching. If this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button and join us as we explore more powerful lessons from history. See you next time.